My advisor believed in IMS so deeply that our entire cycle, right, of research was centered around that whole paper submission, that every year there was an expectation that whether you got into IMS was a really big deal. And then later, Barry Perlman dragged me into AdCom, and to see in memoriam, it's humbling to realize the hard work and the special people that are behind the scenes to make a conference like this exist. It's incredibly important that the international community gets together and shares ideas, especially I think at a time right now. We should not take for granted how incredibly important it is, right, to have this exchange of ideas, that the best people in the world are able to exchange their best ideas. Because I do believe that MTT is a unique society, and I said it for the video, but I really do believe it. That sounds like some sort of marketing tagline, but it's actually something that just came off the top of my head, right? Which is that IMS and MTT more generally is where wireless is changed. It's not where it's used, right? It's actually where things are foundationally altered, say, from the foundation. And so let's talk a little bit where that alteration may come from next. We're going to talk about the mind-body problem, right, for intelligent RF. So let's go back to the very beginning. So if you look at sort of 1G and the AMP system, it was incredibly hard to make this radio, right? Think of alumina filters that were a quarter wavelength, right? They were bricks, right? These brick phones. We look with nostalgia that we would actually have to put a phone in a bag and carry it in our backpack, but the amplifiers were still nascent, right? The gallium arsenide was low yielding, right? So it was very hard to actually create a phone initially, right? But if you look at the frequency plan, it was dead simple, right? We tried to isolate that portion of the spectrum and keep everybody out of the way so we could focus and do our job. But the MTT society, right, got really good at this, and we got more tasks, more frequencies were allocated, right? IEEE joined into the mix, right? Started their own standards to open up wireless to the world. 3G emerged, right? More IEEE standards emerged, and we started to get so good, we started to look all the way up into the millimeter wave bands. And so you've got this massive expansion of frequency options as we've progressed over time based on the capabilities of people in this room and within this society, right? We gave people the confidence to say you can actually start doing all of these different things at once until we now even have, right, the millimeter wave as part of this 5G standard. Now, this has been great progress. Our radios, right, which were really hard to build, are now incredibly flexible and can do a lot of these different things all at once. But it's very difficult, right, to find where the next spectrum is coming from. The era of free spectrum is over. There is no slice of spectrum that's being underutilized that has nationwide access. So that is why you see, right, an incredible amount of churn inside, right, of the decision makers, right, worldwide, trying to figure out where do you find that next portion of spectrum. So these are all of the different bands which are opening up for evaluation, decision making. It's just an inherently political issue of figuring out who wins and loses when you do resource allocation. It's sort of one of the foundational reasons why you have a government in the first place, is to figure out, right, how you do shared resource distribution. But if you look in the labs and say, well, what's around the corner from the radio, we went from a time when the radio was fairly hard, right, to create for that very simple spectrum allocation, go back to that 1G example, right, to a radio which now can work from HF to 40 gigahertz with 8 independent channels, right? So this is just an example that if you look in the lab, the DARPA Hedgehog program, right, you have access to many, many portions of the spectrum, right, and times 8, right, or times many more channels if you want to combine them together. So the radio has gotten much, much better, but the underlying problem of resource allocation has not, right? The underlying problem of complexity management and resource allocation, right, is behind what our radios can do. MTT has outpaced, right, the ability of the world to actually handle how good, right, the radios are that people are developing. So this is something that we face every day. We might not recognize it. If you look at an audio spectrum analyzer, you will see that the spectrum is full. Where our vocal cords work and where our ears hear, right, that isn't changing anytime soon. 20 kilohertz and below, right, is where the audio spectrum, right, is engaged. And no one is trying to sell, right, 10 kilohertz slices, right, or 1 kilohertz slice at 10 kilohertz for $1 billion. Right? We don't work that way. No one told me to speak in the tone of A and you in the tone of E, right, so that we can have this conference. No one pre-planned how we do this engagement. We understand how to do the underlying resource allocation in a full and fixed spectrum. We get to do, right, really unique things like this boat party, where you've got many networks interoperating with each other and interfering with each other, right, without a master of ceremonies, right, without having to ask a person across the room, is it my turn to talk? At what frequency should I talk? We take this for granted, but it's because of the underlying cognition that we have as humans, right, to potentially interfere with each other, but then to correct for that problem. And that's a very different world to live in if you can actually make a mistake and correct from that problem. You don't have to avoid having the interference, right, at all costs. We have to be very judicious on how we allocate spectrum, because if you make a mistake and you don't have a learning system, right, that mistake will exist, right, in perpetuity. The idea of making a mistake and learning from it means I can be a lot more liberal in how I allocate, right, that underlying resource. So recognizing that, right, at our Wait What conference, a slightly younger, lot less hairy version of myself announced, right, that we were going to try to attack this problem at DARPA as one of our major thrusts. So in 2015, we announced that we were going to try to go from the era of broadcast to the era of isolation that we're basically living in right now, where we're telling everybody to stay out of each other's way, into this era of learning. And that era of learning, right, is trying to take that cognitive radio concept, which has been floating around, right, for the last 20 years, and do it at scale. Do what we just showed with that boat party. Demonstrate that we can pass the responsibility for how to interoperate onto the radios themselves, instead of having a central manager who's working years ahead of time, right? Or even for the DoD, a spectrum manager in the field who's giving specific spectrum allocation. All right, so what were we looking at about that time frame, right? So most people know, right, that chess is a game that computers are very good at. And even DARPA, actually, if you go back in history, right, Claude Shannon at MIT was given money by the government even to study and look at, how do you create games like chess with computer systems to figure out how they could beat humans. So that was a goal, over many, many decades, and DARPA funded this as part of a first AI exploration from the 60s on, and in 1997, we had that seminal event where our grand champion, right, of human was beat by a computer, and that actually, they haven't looked back. Computers are continuing to get better at this, and that was based on first wave AI. When we say first wave AI, we think of rules-based expert decision making. It's a relatively simple game. It took a long time to get where we were, but with the right computing resources, you can play enough of the game to be better than a human by describing the human actions in that scripted game. Okay, so this is something that we take for granted at this point, right? But it took a long time to get there. Now, when I started at DARPA in around 2011, there was a lot of discussion about, okay, chess is a type of game, right, where you can do that brute force computation and win. What was more complicated, right, was the game of Go. And in fact, we did a study, ISAT, which is our information study board, and they predicted it was 2020 to 2021, in which it would take, for the computing resources to catch up, where we would actually be able to win a game like Go. Now, Go is a very different game, right? It's much larger board, It's only 2 pieces, but it's harder to describe the board, but most importantly, the depth of the search space grows nearly exponentially. It's a Google times larger than chess in terms of the exploration space. So this would not only took mountains more computing capabilities, but it was actually how they solved that, right? That was the surprise. So instead of working out in 2020, most of us know that AlphaGo, right, was the seminal event there where they beat the grand champion, and it was a shift from that first wave AI, where you're trying to describe how you would play that game, to the second wave of AI, where the machines actually watched the grand champions play the game. And with the neural nets that they had watching the game, they would capture their strategy to the point they could mimic how the grand champions were going to play about 80% of the time. So 80% of the moves that the grand champions were about to do, initially they were able to start predicting, right, before they did it, what was actually going to happen. So once you can mimic, you can start competing, right? But that wasn't enough. Competing wasn't the goal. Winning was the goal. And so they shifted from actually mimicry, right, and feature extraction to actually starting to play against each other. So now you take, right, that relatively polished AI system and start having it play with itself, right, to play against itself, right? And on a very fast time scale, they were then be able to go from being as good as the masters to actually being better. Okay, so that was something that caught the nation's attention, the world's attention, right, as you went from that first wave of AI to showing the power, right, of that second wave, a more statistical learning-based approach. I still don't think that's that interesting for the wireless community. That's still a structured game. That's still like a game where you go, then I go, then you go, then I go. And the wireless world doesn't work that way. In the wireless world, it's generally just much messier. Okay, and we'll get back to what that means and why I say that, and when we compare it to the more recent games, right, that are being played. So after 2016, the community didn't stop. They started to look at more complicated systems like what OpenAI was playing in terms of Dota. Now, this is a much more complex video game. It's continuous, right? And you're playing against a human, right, that can make an action at any one time. Now, of course, it's digital, so you could always go back to how many frames per second. So 30 frames per second over about a 45-minute game. This is about 20,000 potential moves or more that can be made at any one time. You've got 10 different characters, and they all can jump. They can throw different things, right? It's a typical video game, right? But what I think is important here is it becomes a little bit more like the messy wireless world that we live in. You can see the game that was being played here. The computer realized someone was weak, right? And if you move forward, you can see it's actually chasing the human, right, away from the battle so it can isolate it, right, and then finish that attack. Now, you also notice that that human system that's running away is disappearing into a fog. That fog is important because that means the board is partially observable. When you're partially observable, you can't instantaneously react and just make the decision at that moment, so that if you go, then I go, and I look at the board, right, and something's disappeared, I can't just have hyperreactivity, right, and make the decision, right, based on only that amount of information. You need a longer-term strategy, and that is what they were able to come up with, right? For example, in that case, right, following that isolated character, as they disappeared, realizing they will reemerge, right, and they got that level of information, right, by playing hundreds to millions to billions of games, right, repeatedly to come up with what I would think of creativity and strategy. Okay, so it's a longer game, even more exploration space, right, than that Go system, right? A lot messier because of the partial observability and the number of actions that you can make in a continuous mechanism. So you go from a relatively short time horizon, right, from chess, 40 moves on average till you end a game, to something that's longer, 150 moves on Go, to something that can be 20,000 moves or more, as I said, 45 minutes, right, at 30 frames per second, where you can continually make different decisions. It is important that we go from fully observable game to partially observable. When you're talking about that foggy board, right? That starts to feel a lot more like a wireless system. A wireless system doesn't have an omnipotent or omnipresent view of the world around it. You have stochastic events happening, either fading or propagation, right? And you have to be able to manage what's going on around you, even though, right, things may be blinking in and out. The number of actions that you can have in chess is around 35. On Go, it's around 250 at any one moment on average, right? You can have thousands of actions in that continuous gameplay mode for the realistic Dota system. And of course, right, you have that back and forth, I go, then you go, right? That artificialness of that type of a gameplay is replaced with continuous streaming of action that can take place in this high-dimensional and continuous space. So that's kind of what the gaming community has figured out over the last decade, and it's gone very fast. You've actually seen the last 2 or 3 years sort of this huge leap in performance. Now, DARPA asks slightly different questions. We haven't pushed into the game space as much. We ask questions like our DARPA Grand Challenge. So year 1, we ask, can we go from Los Angeles to Las Vegas, right? And use that same type of autonomy, the same concept of pushing the cognition in our systems in real-time recognition to be able to do things like drive across the desert. And people came out of the woodwork, and we ended up with lots of different competitors that quit their jobs and did other heroic things to try to win money from DARPA, which is the first time we'd actually done that, where as opposed to paying you to work, we would pay you if you won. Now, of course, we look back fondly about that type of an event, and in practice, the world is messy. Right? The messiness of the real world caught up to all of those teams as they tried to predict what they would face on the course, and if you, for example, got caught on a berm and started spinning your wheels, you may spin your wheels until your engine catches on fire. And that is what we saw, right, in a massive way, all the way, to the point we had all of the teams fail within 8 miles of that starting line. Right? The lesson learned here is the world is a lot messier, and especially if you're trying to predict what's going to happen, right? Something is going to happen that you weren't able to predict, and that concept of first wave AI for these very complicated tasks end up with huge limitations. We did see enough, right, that we pushed forward, even in the spite of quite negative reaction. Right? This was the cover of Popular Science, and of course the media never over-exaggerates failure. So this was not a great day, right, for DARPA, as they described DARPA's debacle in the desert. But it wasn't a debacle. What it really was is just lessons learned. Like all research, right, you fail so that you can learn, so you can grow from that experience. And so the next year we asked that same question. In that case, we had 5 different teams that finished. This is the Stanford Audi VW team, which finished. This is the Caterpillar General Motors CMU team, which finished second. And what's important is to look at kind of the differences in how people approach those problems as they jumped across, right, that finish line and were able to do those high-level tasks, even though the world is a lot messier than you would like. So this is actually backstage. This is the CMU team, and they got the map the night before, and they started to impart their human knowledge into that car. And you can see this is them actually figuring out what's the right radius to turn, right, around this corner. This is them actually plugging in the speed in which you're going to take that turn. Right? This is a version of that first wave AI, right, where you're trying to take the human experience and that expertise and impart it in a system. You're running a script when you get in the field. Stanford, on the other hand, right, looked at this as an isolated autonomy problem, and how do you take all of the information from all of the sensors that I have inside of this car and start making real-time decisions and pass the responsibility off to the car. You're not actually saying this is how you're going to take this course. It's how you're going to interpret the course. Right, so that's Sebastian Thrun, who went on to Google, then Waymo. But in this case, they red means don't go, white means go, and gray means we haven't made our mind up whether that's passable or not. But once you make that decision, you now let the car change gear, go faster, right, and take the course on its own decision making. So this is a version of what I think has really gone well over the last 10 years of isolated autonomy. You can look at our robotics challenges. You have something very similar, a huge push in capability in regards to how to observe the world around us, right, and how to make the decision of what that opportunity exists. So you take, in this physical challenge, where you actually have to do something in the real world, you've got the mind, which is evolving very quickly with some of the games that I talked about earlier, but now you pair it with the body. The body is the physical interface. Now, with a car, right, it's the engine, the transmission, the brakes, right? That's the physical interface to the real world, but it's also, right, many, many new sensors that are being added. So the mind had to get smarter, but the body had to come along for the ride. We had to have, right, GPS receivers, different LiDAR, other types of sensors that sensed the real world and were that interface for the mind, in this case 7 Pentium M computers, right, so that, right, you could interpret that messy real world. So if you look, 7 Pentium M's was that horsepower of the brain of that self-driving car. And since 2012, right, Moore's Law has provided us the ability to put, right, that same level of horsepower inside of our pocket, right, inside of our wireless systems. So the 7 Pentium M's, even though it was, pretty expensive and a lot of horsepower, a decade later, is relatively trivial in terms of the total amount of flops. That means autonomy is going to be everywhere, right? And it also means that it can be inside of our wireless systems, right? So let's take a look, right, at what that might look like. So how do you start applying this concept of isolated autonomy and flipping the script from writing down what's going to happen to learning from experience? And what would that look like in a wireless system? Well, here's an example of one-on-one communication. If you take that sort of complex boat scene and just isolate just an individual part, this is one radio talking to another radio, right, in an isolated environment. And instead of actually programming those systems, we have them learn and emerge how to do this communication. What you're seeing, this is sped up by 2x, but what you're seeing in near real time is the ability to go from no standard, no structure, right, to what we might recognize as 16 QAM. These are two radios that don't know that that's what they should be, how they should be communicating. This is two radios that are instead seeded with the ability to learn, right, that that's the right environment or right modulation scheme to use for that particular channel. I like to think of this as going from baby talk to babbling to finding the underlying structure to satisfying a language, right, and realizing, in this case, right, sort of eerie, it's gray-coded 16 QAM, or the most efficient way, right, to pack 4 bits of information together in a modulation scheme. It's what I would teach, right, in my basic wireless class. It's what they learned on that 30-second interval, and it's based on not just, right, what they were able to learn together, but also the channel that they're facing, right, for that instantaneous moment. This was line of sight, so it ended up with something that's quite recognizable. But if it's a different channel, it might look vastly different. So let's look at what the radio looks like that does that. So this is work that was done by the Berkeley team, right, when we first started the Spectrum Collaboration Challenge. So instead of having a program that tells it the waveform that's going to be used, right, it just has this neural net. And this neural net is then attached to the transmitter, and it both drives the waveform and then the calibration, right, for that transmitter. And then you put this reward cycle in. And it sends a preamble. The other system receives it, spits it back, right? And the channel impairments are now embedded inside of that preamble. You compare it to the reward cycle, and you change the neural net. And it goes from that really messy constellation where no information is being transformed, and then you hop back and forth from one being the transmitter with the reward cycle to the other one, and then iterate back and forth. In about 30 seconds, you come up with that 16 QAM solution. So it's a very different way to kind of look at how you would use these type of second wave AI techniques inside of our radio systems. But that's not the challenge, right? We very rarely have a wireless system that is only communicating with one other wireless system. So this becomes a much harder challenge when you actually look at the big picture. How do you have multiple radios talking to each other? How do you have networks talking to each other? And then how do you have networks of networks talking to each other? We aren't alone in the world very often. This idea of ensemble intelligence is something that's unique to the wireless world, right? But needs to be solved if it's actually going to solve real-world problems. Just having one system that's smart to understand its environment is really important for self-driving, right? It's important for robotics. In the wireless world, you need a collection of decision makers to agree how they're going to interoperate. While we were sorting this out, the gaming community didn't sit still. This is the OpenAI 5 team now playing Dota 2. And in 2019, what they showed is that 5 independently trained LSTMs, which is basically a highly recurrent neural net, were independently trained and then could collaborate together to beat a team of humans. Right? This is the type of thing that people thought wasn't going to be possible. You needed a new type of learning structure, right, where they would share information in some sort of unique way. Instead, they just showed that you can independently train these players or these machines with these recurrent neural nets and then have them collaborate through the gameplay. And very recently, I believe May of this year, it's the first time, right, that ensemble of AI systems have been able to beat an ensemble, right, of human experts. In fact, the best team in the world, right, was beaten by those systems. So now you have something very interesting and now something the wireless community should pay attention to. The ability to work in a partially observable state with long time horizons, right, in a messy world. It is starting to feel like a wireless system, even though you wouldn't recognize that from observing from afar. How did they get there? OpenAI 5 plays 180 years worth of games against itself every day. And so 180 years, right, in a 24-hour period, I guess looking back at it, you're like, well, they probably get pretty smart with that level, right, of training. This is something we don't have in the wireless data, or at least we don't have in the wireless world. We don't have that type of data. We don't have that type of training, right? So that's an asymmetry where you're playing a game versus the human world. And of course, they're hopeful, right? They're saying, why are we spending all this money and looking at these games? It's because they're hopeful that these concepts carry over into the real world. And the real world here, right, being something that matters for society, like spectrum allocation. People make money, people's lives are saved, based on the communication that the wireless spectrum provides. The open question is, can you translate this type of strategic decision-making into something that would actually matter for society? So that is why, right, we went from that wait what pronouncement that we're going to try to figure out how to build that next generation of cognitive radio to creating the challenge, the spectrum collaboration challenge. And the RF Coliseum went live in the middle of the summer of 2017. And we started with about 90 teams, and it necked down to about 20 who actually got really good at this. And now they were scrimmaging and practicing 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And that's just a weird concept for wireless systems. These systems are now training, competing with each other, learning from each other in this continual cycle. There are teams that are scrimming each other as we speak right now, right? And the systems are smarter now than they were when I just said that sentence, right, a second ago. Okay? So that idea of training and using the learning cycles for the wireless space is something that we needed to create a virtual environment for. The RF Coliseum is what we call it. It's the arena where we can take the propagation statistics from anywhere, right? We can do this building and then impart it inside of this virtual space, all right? So you can plug in hundreds of software-defined radios, and those software-defined radios could then figure out how they're going to collaborate potentially interfere, but potentially then learn from that interference. The radios in this case are relatively standard software-defined radios, but they have GPUs that are added. So you've got an FPGA, you've got a CPU, and you've got a GPU at your disposal, representing what we believe a radio of the future might have in terms of horsepower, sort of 5 or so years from now. So they're not the same challenge, but they are something that you probably should pay attention to as a wireless engineer. SC2 has a long horizon. In fact, you would say the wireless world has an infinite horizon. We don't have a stopping point when we don't need wireless anymore. So whatever strategy you create needs to be work for infinite time, or at least long enough until your boundary conditions change, which is happening continually. So you need strategies which are continually adjusting, right, to the physics and the data demands of the moment, right? And that is on this left side for the wireless system. On the right side, we have about 20,000 moves till its end. So they're long time frames, need to have long range, long-term decision making imparted on them. It's a partially observable state. I've already stated it, but it's worth repeating. Right, the fact that there's fog in these games, that you actually have a partially observable game, changes the type of decision making and makes it a lot more, right, like a wireless system. I do not have omnipresent or omnipotent information about where everyone is around me. I just have a streaming time series that's coming very fast, and I need to make sense of that information. And ultimately, the fact that they're both collaborative is very interesting, right? Meaning, I'm going to have networks of networks, and in this case, in the game system, we just have networks. So what are we learning? So this is an example, right, of an observer coming into a situation where it's going to get the cold shoulder. So instead of 3 radios, this is actually 3 networks of radios. I've got 5 radios on one side, represented by one person, 5 radios represented by another, and then a new system is going to say, I want to join your spectrum, right? Is there room? So this is what you'll see here. You'll see the red system that is dynamic. It's hunting and pecking, looking for the opportunity that exists. The blue and the green are on a standards-based system. They're not going to react. These are not reactive radios. That's done on purpose. And the red has to recognize that it's not welcome, that it's getting the cold shoulder, and has to work elsewhere. This is how you and I would probably approach this problem. This is courtesy. Right? If you're not wanted in a conversation, you go elsewhere. You'd think that that's pretty obvious, but if you actually look at what most of the teams did, this was actually a really hard challenge. This is a team that's hunting and pecking, trying to figure out where the opportunity exists, right? And it lands. You can sense that it knows there's a problem. It knows that it's actually hurting the other teams and is stepping on top of their spectrum, but doesn't have the dexterity to get out of the way. It gets skinny, right, but is still right on top, right, of the data transmissions of the other teams. Right? That would be what I would consider being annoying. And then last but not least, right, we have the ugly here, right, which is someone who's completely not self-aware. You may know this person in your life, right? You give them the cold shoulder, they hop out of the way, but they don't have a long-term learning strategy. They hop back in the way. And a lot of the teams that were doing dynamic spectral access looked a lot like this. If it works with 2 or 3 radios, you can be hyper-reactive. I transmit, you get out of my way. You transmit, I get out of your way. You just do that dance. It scales for 2, 3, 4 radios. It does not scale to, in this case, 25 radios. Right? You go back right on top of the problem that you caused in the first place unless you develop a long-term strategy. So that was step 1. That was in December 2017 where we sort of observed those types of phenomena. In following year, December 2018, we had our second event. And in this case, we asked for much harder tasks. Now, this is virtual Austin. This is Austin, Texas, virtualized in the Coliseum. And now we have first responders. Teams of first responders would, for example, be clearing rooms after a hurricane, making sure the populace is okay. And they go from, let's see, 1G or 2G, where they just have voice in stage 1, to stage 2, where they have voice, imagery, and data, and talking to a UAV. to stage 3, where everybody has full body cams. Think of maybe 5G type data transfer, much higher capacity demands on that overall system. So this is actually what that gameplay looks like, or that virtualization looks like. These are the first responders moving through virtual Austin, right, going from stage 1 to stage 2 to stage 3, where they have to be aware of the interference they're causing each other, and then aware of the demands that each of the networks are being placed to them, on them, right, as they move through that board. And you can see there isn't an idea of you stay over there at this frequency, I stay over at this frequency. They're figuring out how to share that pie, right, by signaling and cueing to each other on how they're going to actually solve this very complex problem. If you look at the on the right there, you can see this is what the scoreboard looks like. I won't dive into all the details, it's pretty complicated, but on the top, what you see is some of the teams that tried to be more human-like and say, you stay in your lanes, right, and we're going to solve this problem by isolating each other. That actually did not work. That was actually a very, very low-scoring team. On the bottom, you see that mosaic of real-time decision-making and how that actually was the type of teams that won. This is the first time we actually saw that collaborative decision-making, that real-time decision-making allowed you, right, to have higher capacity inside of your network than a human-allocated system. So we went from, on the left here, 13 megabits per second through the entire system. We gave them a limited bandwidth. And they went from 13 megabits from a human-allocated, frequency-allocated system to about 50% higher with 19 megabits per second. That was great to see that idea of decentralized decision-making could overcome prior decision-making by a human. What I think is more important is, theoretically, we still have a long way to go. From 19 megabits per second to theoretically, in this case, we had 52 megabits per second, which could have gotten through that system if they were to optimize. So good, still a long way to go as we move forward. October 23rd, 2019, we are going to go to Mobile World Congress in LA and host our finale. And we will see how far we can take this. I can tell you it's looking good. It will not be solved. These are not the type of problem that you solve at any one time. We will see how far the community has taken it based on this concept we started 3 years ago. So what you must be asking yourself, great, right, another AI hype discussion. What does this mean for the RF components community? So we asked some of the competitors to come and talk to the hardware folks at our ARI conference that kicked off in July 2018. And this is Greg Wright from Nokia Bell Labs, who was one of the competitors who said, we have a mind-body problem, right, for intelligent radios. I stole that talk because I liked the concept, but it's important to listen to what he had to say as a competitor when he's asking you, right, to help him and the AI teams that are trying to do some of the radios. He says, right, we have a mind-body problem. I need to be able to sense the environment very accurately and respond to it very quickly. Okay, so step one, right, is not just how good your radio can perform, how reactive can that radio be, and maybe a little bit more red meat for the designers here. He's begging for better analog radios. The radios we're using have 14 bits over 100 megahertz slice of spectrum. His estimate is he needs 5 extra bits to work because he doesn't have the pre-selection filtering. Right, I told you we're going to embrace interference instead of isolate from it. Right? That means you need better hardware. He needs 19 bits, right, and his data converter's over 100 megahertz, right, for him to complete even the simple challenges that we were giving him. He says we need tunable high-quality filters. Right? That's great as someone who used to design, right, tunable high-quality filters. I will expand on that a little bit, though. He's saying we need filters to increase isolation. There's other ways to increase isolation. You do not have to think of this as sort of just create more bits in your A to D or just create filtering, right? There's other concepts that are floating around. We need more linearity. We need alternative isolation mechanisms and the ability to respond and quickly respond in multiple bands. So here's some of the work that we're doing at DARPA that gives you a little bit of hope or a little bit of a hint as to where we may be heading. This is the M-Cubic program. Northrop Grumman and a local company here, Metamagnetics, have created these magnetic frequency selective limiters now they respond to any signal that's above a certain threshold. So they respond and create nulls exactly where, right, that interferer is coming. I don't have to even think about it. I think of this as an instinctual part of the system. Instinctually, it gets rid of the problem. Right? I don't think about moving my hand when I touch something that's too hot. Right? Now I have a component that is getting rid of the interference that is too hot or too bright, but only, right, at the frequencies where it's occurring, and then all the low power signals still pass through. Of course, I can go from 14 bits to 19 bits in my A to D, and if I put it behind a LNA that's saturating, then I have not actually solved my problem. So we are now looking at things like the DREAM system, or DREAM program, right, to push not just power density, which we've done for transmitters for the last 30 years, now looking at the linearity metric as well. How do we stand up to very large signals by looking at new materials, new structures, and new epitaxy, so that we can actually see what's going on in the environment and not just the nonlinearities that are generated inside of my system. If we want to get a little bit more exotic, we can look at the SPAR program, signal processing at RF. We now have correlators at the antenna. Right? We use CDMA back in the digital portion of the system to untangle based on code. How do we push that into things like acoustic or RF acoustic correlators? Or, in this case, we're doing gallium nitride correlators at the antenna itself. So it's isolating based on the code structure, not time and frequency. Okay, so that's another type of advancement. Right? That's shown here. This is actually UC Davis, Leo Liu, and his team were able to show the isolation from a huge interferer. The red interferer, right, is a huge amount of noise on top of a signal. Then only the blue system is correlating, and so it's the only thing that gets through into the RF receiver. And of course, many of you are working on our MIDAS program. You can always use polarization and angle, right, to provide isolation on top of what you would do just with the brute force, adding more bits to the A to D. All right, so we got a long way to go. From 2004, we had our car on fire moment to a relatively healthy, right, self-driving car industry. Over the same time frame, right, we're going to have the body and the mind keeping up with each other as we push towards that next generation of real decision-making in the field where every radio is smart enough to know, right, how to engage, just like humans know how to engage in that boat party scene. So I've walked you through sort of these waves of AI which are occurring from chess and the first wave of AI to the second wave of AI with Go to what's maybe more important toward the edge of what we call contextual reasoning. Right? That's kind of what the game playing community is observing right now. DARPA is putting around $2 billion into that space to figure out what is on the other horizon, right, of what we're starting to see in terms of that contextual reasoning. I think it's useful to kind of look at what's in the research labs inside of what that yellow bar might look like. This is the lifelong learning machines program. This is a robotic arm that instead of being programmed is taught to self-play and have a self-consistent representation of the arm movement. The shadow which you will see on top of that system, right, is what the robot thinks its arm is doing. And after about 36 hours of play, it's consistent enough to be able to do this high-level task of grabbing these balls and putting them in the beaker. Well, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just program it? Because we could all program the XYZ coordinates to be able to do this. The reason is now you add a new arm, right, which now has a deformation and is longer, and it relearns. It first recognizes that it's no longer trusted to do that task, flags that, re-engages through self-play to be able to repeat that task, right, without human intervention. Right? That's just an example of what you see sort of in that next generation yellow bar. In the RF space, we are rightfully not pushing that limit. We're back. Right? We're somewhere between first and second wave. That's kind of where the spectrum collaboration challenge is. That's good. We're users, right, of the artificial intelligence space, which is being figured out. But as this pathway of third wave contextual reasoning gets solved, I think it's a huge opportunity for the MTT community. We're building things like saliency into our systems. What should I be looking at any one moment? My eyes are focusing on not everything that I could possibly look at, The brain is sending signals for me to focus on what's interesting at that moment. That's the type of thing that is baked inside of contextual reasoning, which we've never figured out or haven't even looked at yet in terms of how it applied to the RF community. So there's a long way to go, but I think it's a ripe space for MTT to take leadership on. Right? It's not comfortable because it's being led by the computer science community. Right? You need to form teams and pull that information back into the application domain. Luckily, they're making that really easy. Think about it as math. Think about it as statistics. We don't avoid using math and statistics because that's what mathematicians do. Right? AI is a tool which is being pulled back into the application domain, and that's the opportunity that your community, my community, our community, right, has in front of us. And with that, I guess I'll take questions.